Welcome to the Integral Stage. What is the interplay of improv and improve? What does jazz have to do with shamanism? What do improvisation and shamanism have to do with our once and future thriving? In this Integral Stage Mindwalk, jazz scholar and radio personality Greg Thomas joins Layman Pascal for a lively riff on these and related themes. Greg has been a frequent contributor on Integral Life and a member of many of our online Integral communities, so I'm especially excited to have him here. Not only does he live and breathe jazz, he's an insightful social commentator and a longtime student and practitioner of multiple spiritual traditions. And just this week, in honor of Black History Month, the well-known meditation app Calm released a sleep story he created especially for them. If you're interested, check out the details in the video description below. I'll include some links there. So now, without further ado, I'll turn the stage over to Greg and Layman. I hope you enjoy the conversation.
Well, where to start on this? When I was taking a look at your blog, tuneintoleadership.com,
right,
I was reading the article on improv at almost exactly the same moment that I'd already been thinking about improvisation in shamanism and like primordial, naturalistic, ecosystemically responsive religion.
Okay.
And so I just thought, what a tremendously unifying concept improv could be. Applies to music, applies to comedy, could apply to religion and spirituality, and you could probably scale it up pretty easy to apply to the entire cosmos.
Right. Yes.
There's a kind of thing, you touched on it in your article, but the famous thing from comedy, which is the yes and, right?
That's right.
Take what somebody else has and work with it. It's awful similar to Wilbur's both and. There's an integral thing there in terms of including the perspective of the other. There's an integral thing there in terms of being at your leading edge or
yes,
leading edge of a we, whatever leading edge it is. There's a lot of ties, so we don't have to get too bogged down in integral theory. I just think it's a fascinating thing, and so many of the elements of higher thought and deeper feeling that everybody is concerned about is creativity, flow, finding that edge, and finding that edge by yourself and with others. So I think it's a tremendously good topic.
Thank you. I agree. I mean, improvisation is really ubiquitous to not only human existence, but really from what science, cutting edge evolutionary biology and physics, it's ubiquitous and central to evolution of life, evolution of human beings. So I guess if that's the case, it's kind of understandable that improvisation would be a part of our lives if it's on those levels already, you know? But in terms of music, jazz in particular, improvisation is one of the foundational practices of jazz. And that's my passion. That's my avocation, vocation. I'm in it, as my folks in the South would say, every which way, you know, I'm involved in jazz. So improvisation is central to music in that particular musical style or idiom. And I think it's important for some historical and cultural reasons. And I definitely want to reach back to what you were saying in the very beginning, because, you know, but to talk about that article, which dealt with improvisation and does it have anything to do with science and spirituality? And I think my ending place was that, yes, it has something to do with all those things. But fundamentally in jazz, you can look at improvisation a couple of ways. One, spontaneous composition. So oftentimes there's I think a false dichotomy between composing and improvising. There was one great composer who said that composing is just improvising slowed down, you know. The great Jimmy Heath, jazz composer, arranger, saxophonist who grew up practicing and playing with John Coltrane and who followed in Philadelphia and followed in the path of Charlie Parker. I interviewed him some years ago. He passed away very recently. And he said it's spontaneous composition. And he said it's interesting when you listen to the great composers improvise, it's like they're composing as they're playing. But that's true for a writer. I'm a writer. When you're composing as a writer, you're improvising. It's true for scientists. When a scientist experiments, that's a form of improvisation. When an entrepreneur takes certain risks, not knowing where he or she is going to end up, you got to improvise. So improvisation is really key to all those things, but I really like your reference to improv comedy with yes and. That's so fundamental, because if you're talking about a conversation, which itself is improvisational, we have an idea of our topic, our themes, but we don't know exactly where this conversation is going to go, so it's improvisational. If you have a conversation and you say yes, but, that puts a stop on it. But yes and, the spirit of yes and says, I'm going to listen, I'm going to take what you say, and I'm going to add to it, and then we're going to grow together. And it creates kind of an emergent quality. The evolutionary biologist Brandon Oguno from Brown University, when I had a class on improvisation at Jazz at Lincoln Center, that's one of the things he said that's so fabulous about improvisation in jazz and how it connects with evolutionary biology. He says that you have these interacting parts, and the way that they work together ends up creating an emergent quality. So all of these things kind of work together, and I'm excited to explore them with you, man.
I really liked this notion that composition is improvisation slowed down. It made me think of actually a conference. First time I met Bruce was at this Integral Theory conference. And I had these 3 different moments that I guess all gave me satisfaction.
Okay.
And the first one was I wrote this original piece, and they thought, well, you could come and present that at the conference. Great. In that moment, at the beginning, it was improvisational as I wrote it. Then I realized I didn't have nearly enough time to present everything. So I had to compress it. So there was this second wave of improvisation where I had to figure out now how to rearrange everything. And there was no, set description of how to do that. I had to make that up. And even then I realized still it's too much stuff to say. And I was out the prior night to a party with the volunteers who ran the event. There was this lovely young woman, and she said, why don't you just do the question and answer part? And I thought, fantastic, because at that point I was so familiar with the material, I could have performed it verbatim. I knew it, but I couldn't get that special thrill I got from writing it just by reciting it. The only way, and it turned out to be fantastic, I just opened up to question and answer at the very beginning, and I was right back in that same spot I was in when I started with those ideas. And it's a relaxation because you know the material, and it's an edge because you're on and you don't know what's going to happen next. But it's also a spot where you remember why you love this stuff.
Yeah.
When you're repeating it, you don't always remember why you love it. But when you have to pick it up again, you remember.
I hear what you're saying, man. That's so key. I mean, while you're creating something, it's like that right side, that right hemisphere is clicked on and you're just flowing. But I know as a journalist and as an essayist and a feature writer, you got to bring in the other parts, and you're going to have to do some editing, so you got to use different parts of your brain for that. But the Q&A, I love that, because I thrive on situations where either I'm giving an address or a lecture, and there's moments of Q&A. I really thrive on that. Some people I find get thrown off by that. I dig it because it gives me a chance to vibe on where the audience is coming from and the participants are coming from. And then if you know the material, that's why certain fundamental principles and practices are key. You got to know your stuff. You got to have practice, studied, to be able to even be on the stage. And jazz, like at the Apollo Theater, for example, where they boo your butt down if you're not bringing it, you have to be ready. And if you're not ready, then either don't go on the stage or get ready to get your butt kicked and go back and practice and improve. But those moments when you don't know what's going to come, but you can thrive and riff on it and even draw on parts of your knowledge and yourself that you hadn't necessarily intended to when you wrote what you wrote originally. But it's there. Like you said, if you're prepared, you know your stuff, man, you can really riff, you can swing, you can improv.
There's trying to find out if there's pathways in what we're saying that I could go back to the shamanism element of it, because I started.
Well, why don't you?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, but why don't you because we had a little exchange.
Yeah.
And I'm still curious as to where that springs from. I mean,
well, I'll tell you, primarily where it comes from is my own experience of these things.
Okay.
In two ways. That I have a certain kind of antipathy to formalized practices under certain conditions. But I also have this tremendous love for and background in nature-sourced mysticism and ritual.
Okay.
There's states you can go into in yourself, and that's one kind of thing. But there's another kind of thing with people and with objects and with the natural environment and with animals, and synchronicity gets high, and you're not completely convinced that you're programming the world, but it's not out of the question.
Okay.
And you feel that you are in an eternal and primal place, that you're not doing the kind of religious practice that is inherited as a form. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but you're doing the kind of religious practice that is the foundation of forms, as if you're standing in the spot where all traditions are invented. Or rather than knowing how to work with that which has been consecrated, you're practicing the skill of consecrating. And that's very responsive. It's very collaborative because, if you can imagine the primitive shaman, he only has what nature is showing him. And he's going to make an evaluation. He's going to go, this stone, not any of those other stones, this one. And he's going to make an interior gesture and a communication to the people around him and say, we're going to treat this one as sacred, special, consecrated. This is the one that we see the everything in. So there's this skill of consecration in it that I love. And also it's extremely unpredictable, extremely responsive to the circumstance. And I even have something like an ethical concern about the inherited traditions, which is they may lose their juice over time.
Right.
I have a lot of North American indigenous friends, and many of them are concerned about intergenerational trauma, and sometimes they've taught me to talk about it and think about it as if it was a curse, right? They're very comfortable with some of those terminologies.
Right.
And they'll go to practices, they'll go to shamans that they're aware of, and yet it doesn't seem from the outside that it's necessarily working. And so I'm always thinking, is there something broken in your shamanism? And I don't want to say that the shamanism is broken, but it may need to be renewed, right?
Are you talking about, when you say broken, are you talking about the person who is going to the shaman, or the shaman's effectiveness with the person who is dealing with intergenerational trauma? Yeah,
what I mean is the shaman's practice is insufficient to meet the needs of the community if the communities that invest themselves in those shamans continue to suffer in the same ways. Now, there's a lot of stuff that could be unpacked in different directions there, but what I see is the potential for a renewal in a renewed commitment to the improvisational quality of primal shamanism. And I think that's applicable not just to indigenous communities, but to every kind of inherited sacred tradition.
All right, so let's explore this.
Okay.
It seems to me that there's an intermediary place between the originary shamanic impulse, we can call it that, and organized religion. And that is the esoteric traditions of, say, the major religions. The exoteric traditions are the outer teachings, for quote unquote the masses. But the esoteric inner teachings of Islam, Sufism, of Judaism, Kabbalah, of Christianity, the Gnostic tradition. And I'm sure in other major religions, there are the same kind of esoteric dynamics. So on the esoteric side, the inner teachings, which in my comparative religion study and somewhat practice, I say somewhat because I grew up a Christian, but I've studied Taoism, Kabbalah. I meditate daily, and I've been meditating for quite a while. So I have a connection with these things, but I don't want to speak as if I have authoritative, knowledge on these things. But it just seems to me that when you look at the underpinning messages in the esoteric traditions, at least that I've studied, you find that there is a mystical tie to all of them, by which I mean a way in which we can tap into our souls and our spirits and realize our oneness with the source, our oneness with the one, our oneness, the universe, the one verse, the one song, all that kind of thing, you dig? So perhaps that part of the organized religions are a way to connect the shamanistic and maybe that's not what you're looking for. I'm just saying that for me, having some knowledge of that might be an intermediary place. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's the ideal function of those organized structures. Okay. And I think that they do it better or worse over time. I think the esoteric lineage also does it better or worse over time. They can lean a little bit more towards the mundane and the calcified, or they can lean a little bit more towards, the experiential, the mystical, the awakened. Right. And I think they need to probably going forward have a more clear and conscious awareness of their need to be constantly refreshed. Mm. However, I would also think that the culture is changing overall. Yes. And that what we consider to be a sufficient exoteric practice is going to be a little bit more improvisational going forward. In the same sense that we're looking at YouTube podcasters for news now. We're not looking at formal journalists.
That's right.
We're looking for something looser, and the overall structure is getting looser as well. Right. And I think that's good, but then we have to transfer a little bit from keeping up the structure to having the skills to move with what's happening.
Right. And this takes me back to jazz. I mean, the blog that you mentioned, which is tuneintoleadership.com, is powered by the company I run with my wife, Jazz Leadership Project. And what we do is work with organizations to help them individually develop a mindset and to, as groups in the organization, develop these skill sets and mindsets and heart sets to work in a way that is jazz-like, that's based on skill, that's based on autonomy, but it's autonomy and skill and excellence in the service of a group communal effort based on purpose, values, and such. So when you talk about development of those skills and those capacities to be able to deal with the incredible changes that are going on all around us due to technology, digital, internet, AI, we can go on and on and on. Definitely an improvisational mindset and skill set will be totally necessary, because that also equates to being resilient. It also equates to being anti-fragile improvisationally when you're swinging, so that the things that happen that can be viewed as negative or that can be against you, you actually use it as a way to become stronger, to learn, to grow, to develop, to evolve consciously in it. But that foundation of knowledge and skills have to be there. But the thing is, even with those knowledge and skills, there's going to be stuff that happens that you don't have the awareness of, that you're not ready for. And that's why having an open, kind of a participatory, improvisational edge, to use another word that you've used, is essential, I think, for our moving forward as human beings moving in the future. So even though we focus for JLP on organizations, this mission is something that is totally crucial, I think, for us to get to the next stage of our development, frankly, as human beings.
No, I agree with that very much. And while you were saying that, I was starting to think about a disposition to be willing to experience things that might initially seem negative or problematic.
Right.
And that's partly the anti-fragile, and it's partly a kind of spiritual self-confidence that you think, maybe I can handle this.
Mm-hmm.
In the shamanic sense, right? We go, imagine back 10,000 years, this is the guy taking the drug. This is the guy going into the wilderness by himself. He's risking a lot of things that when you first think of them, they feel very uncomfortable.
Right.
And there's a lot of what we do every day, every moment, where we're trying to protect ourselves from encroaching discomfort. And it leads us maybe to grab too strongly onto things that look like they're stable structures, even if we're actually in a world that's much more fluid than that. So I think this basic openness in the face of what might be uncomfortable, a little bit of taking that risk and telling yourself, whether it feels this way or not, you got to tell yourself, yeah, this is a good risk. It's good for me to take a little risk.
Absolutely. I think of someone who I'm so fond of, Diane Musho Hamilton. I've done work with her through 10 Directions, and she deals with the whole dynamic of sameness and difference in human life. That sameness feels good, there's, the happy chemicals are released, oxytocin and that kind of thing, you're with your group and you're vibing. But as soon as difference comes up, there's the element of possible threat, which doesn't feel good. But you can say the irony or just the evolutionary reality is through difference and is through that which will take us out of our comfort zones that opens up the way to growth and development. So I think sameness and difference, the way Diane presents it, is another way of dealing with some of these same dynamics of the unknown, incredible changes that are going on, but being comfortable with that. I mean, that ties to, diversity, that ties to so many things. But if you would allow me to, I would like to ask you a question about something you mentioned in passing before.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you. You talked about intergenerational trauma. And I've been aware of this idea for a good 20, 25 years, because I used to be a producer on WBAI New York, and on the show would come some scholars, or maybe I should say academics as opposed to scholars, who posited that the experience that we had as Black folks is passed on generationally. But a question that I never hear asked, never, is if trauma can be passed on intergenerationally, cannot resilience and the ability to rebound and resist also be passed on intergenerationally? Is it only the negative that's passed on? I never hear that asked. You know what I mean? So, to try to tie together our themes, it seems to me that an attitude of openness, participation, willingness to risk, willingness to confront difference, willingness to experience tension, but in musical terms, that can be released, tension released, would open us up to the possibility that even that which is traumatic, when viewed from a particular perspective and when going through a process, psychological and spiritual, of healing, that one can actually rebound from trauma and not stay stuck in that place of victimhood. I truly believe that folks can be victimized, experience that without becoming victims in terms of an identity or status. And some of these things, you know, I don't get a chance to say, and I don't hear them talked about or said much, but I appreciate the forum and an opportunity to riff and improvise, you know, on some of these things. What do you think of that, Layman?
I appreciate that coming up, and there's a notion in spirituality sometimes that the impersonal and the tranquil are the destination of all practices. And there may be people and times and places in history where it is important to emphasize those qualities. But in a very fluid and uncertain world in particular, and knowing what we now know about human beings and organisms and minds, strength, you know, like you say, resilience and anti-fragility and becoming more robust, and not just identifying yourself as something that cannot be traumatized, as an eternally untouched principle.
No.
Something that's very engaged, but which nonetheless is oriented toward the possibility of traumatic growth, for lack of a better term.
That's interesting.
It might be able to turn this around. It might be able to benefit from this. Now, there might be some things we can't. Some things might just destroy you, but
right.
That basic orientation, that type of mindfulness, seems to me the lesson of history, and certainly the lesson we need to draw going forward into an extremely unsettled, quasi-apocalyptic kind of cultural zone that we're entering now.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I tell you, I mean, you wonder, because I read a lot, I listen to certain people and it's a range of stuff, you know, from integral to in the cultural sphere and the spiritual sphere. And you mentioned post-apocalyptic. Well, you know, there's some folks that, you know, say all this stuff is going on, it's prophesied, and we're nearing the end. Others say that the old paradigm is dying out and it's in the last throes of its existence, and something new is going to be birthed. Now, there are dynamics of both probably going on at the same time, and which is why it's important for us to be in conversation with those level of awareness and consciousness, so that if we can hold those things together and can together work towards that better, brighter future, which is possible, even with the technological changes, even with all of the disruption that's going on in various industries and such, we still have our human creativity, our ability to innovate and improvise. And if we know that, we should be harnessing those things so that we can, no matter what happens, find ways to benefit and grow from it for the sake of not only humanity, but for the sake of the planet.
I think these are the kind of dynamic wisdom skills that are, I want to say, called for at the moment. What I really mean is they were essential the whole time, but we're seeing more clearly now that we need them. And I mean, that's interesting that there are some things that seem to be constant, like you mentioned, the esoteric and exoteric dimensions of religiosity. And yes, there's always the mystic, and there's always the structure of the sacred that's brought forth to remind you, but also to serve a function for the community.
Right.
And yet there's something that seems like it's part of our time, whatever that, whether it's the last 10 years or the last 50, that predisposes us to be more interested in the shamanic, to be more interested in the improvisational. And some of that, I'm sure, is technological, like a Marshall McLuhan effect. The digital media gives us these changes. Some of it, I'm sure, is chemical, right? One of the interesting things that the traditional jazz community and the traditional shamanic community has in common is the use of psychoactive substances to try to see things and to enter flow states and to get out of their normal mode of consciousness. And those chemicals, they put you in something that you have to deal with. It's not like having a cup of coffee. Right? You have to become improvisational because you have to adapt to what's coming up in the moment. Right. So I think the use of entheogens and psychedelic substances in greater or lesser degrees helps create a culture, a jazz culture, a shamanic culture, but also in the last half a century, the use of these substances has exploded in our civilization. So we're all getting more improvisational experience, for better or worse. And if it's worse, then we're seeing the need to be better at fluidly adapting, enfolding what happens to us and trying to emerge what we'd like to have out of that.
I hear you. I agree. But let's look at the Flow Genome Project with Jamie Wheel and, what's the gentleman who you partnered with to write that excellent book? One of the things they talk about, I don't have the book in front of me, is how you're right. The use of these substances, psychoactive substances, that very much, it's been happening a long time, but the 60s, there was an explosion of it. But there are dangers to it, not just in the individual taking drugs, becoming addicted. We know that. That's a danger. That's very real. But without one doesn't need a formal structure necessarily. One needs guides. Let's use the shaman. I know that in Native communities, there are experiences that you can have where you take certain substances and you have those experiences. You are with someone who is trained to help you through that, and importantly, to help you integrate that experience. You could have a mind-blowing, soul-opening experience. If it's not properly integrated, it can be very problematic. So I think, and let me say this, the good news, and you're probably aware of this, is that I know that there are some institutions that are helping to train people to work with those who are taking these substances and to do it in a way that it doesn't become addictive, do it in a way that it is integrated into their whole being, so that, because it's so, without being handled properly, there's all kind of stuff that go wrong. Now, that's on the personal. Then on the third person side, on the right side of the four quadrants, particularly the lower right, you have these structures that are in place that whenever you have a technology, whether it's a pharmaceutical technology, whether it's any number of technologies, you have a military industrial complex that wants to take that and use it and weaponize it. I mean, this is one of the things that is just real and has happened over and over through human history. So my question is, how do we can look at the great positives of having experiences that over a longer term in meditation, or maybe in a short term, you take a substance. I'll give you an example. I had an experience about 2 years ago with a private group in which we took a substance, and it was a substance that opened up your heart center. And it was such a beautiful experience. It was just so warm and just wonderful. But we were in a group where it was a controlled environment, and we were able to integrate the experience together the next day. I guess my concern is that without structures to make sure that these things not so much are regulated, but that people can integrate these experiences, that it can be very problematic. It's just a concern of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a classic concern. And I think it's one of the strong arguments that the institution of the shaman, or whatever that represents,
right,
is an essential one going forward, because somebody has to show you, and somebody has to tell you which things to take and what to watch out for when you're starting. Somebody has to demonstrate and encourage the assimilation.
Right.
Somebody has to help you understand the context it's going to go into and other ways to have the same experience. Right. So there's a real need for these characters. I don't think there's a need for it to be locked down, right? I think there's a lot of people who are overly anxious about substances and all kinds of altered state experiences.
Right.
There's other people who are a little bit too blasé about it.
Mm.
And somewhere between those two, the culture has to find its way forward, because some of it's got to run wild. Some of it's got to explore and experiment.
That's going to happen. Yeah, that's going to happen.
Some people are going to take that risk, and they're like entrepreneurs. They don't know what's going to happen, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Some people, and the 60s was full of that. I'm going to take this whole bag and see what happens when I get on the plane. I don't want to do that, and I don't recommend it. That person they're like a war hero, right? If it turns out it was absolutely the wrong thing to do, then we learned our lesson through their failure.
I guess they call that the avant-garde, the troops that go out first, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Nassim Taleb in Anti-Fragile, he talks about how everybody who dies on a plane is essentially a hero, right? They make every other plane safer.
Right.
So there's a spot for that collectively. However,
true,
in practice, for most of us, most of the time, and collectively going forward, we need to figure out a way to empower and protect each other. And it's not like there's just a small subclass of people who are shaman priests who are they inherit the knowledge and they know the skills. They're improvisers, and they need to help you become an improviser in a way that's slow enough for you to actually do it and assimilate it, but fast enough so that it challenges you.
Right. And one of the things that I'm very hopeful about is that there are people right now undergoing training. I was trying to think of, there's an academic institution in California, the California Institute of Integral Studies, is it? Does that ring a bell? But anyway.
Ring a bell. Yeah. If we find out, we can link it at the end.
Did I get it?
Give them the thumbs up.
Okay. So I'm pretty sure that they are actually training people to help other people deal with the experience. And why is this crucial? From the other end of the scale, I express my concerns. We need folks to wake the heck up to reality. And I'm not talking about reality just politically or economically. I'm talking about big reality in terms of spiritual reality and our inheritance in our souls, our inheritance as individual expressions of the infinite, to bring the infinite into our finite dimension. And these substances can actually help people wake up to their potentialities, to being beyond just their waking consciousness. And there are people being trained now to help people go through that. That's the great thing. And I think CIIS is one of those places. So I didn't want to say that on the other end. But, something, to try to bring some of this together, I think about the brain and how in improvisation, if you are very skilled, right, you integrate your knowledge and you're able to enact it in some way pragmatically, in practical terms. A beginner who's learning a skill is using actually more brain power than those who are more skilled in that area. And when you become to be a master, it goes from the conscious to more of the unconscious, to where certain things are second nature, and it can truly flow in a way where it's like poetry in motion. You know what I mean? And they have done brain scans to show that people who are highly skilled are using less of their brain parts. In improvisation, I think they call it transient hypofrontality, where parts of your frontal cortex shuts down so that you can improvise. The part that is judging, that is making you like, it's yes, but, the parts that are yes and are the ones that are opening up. And some of these substances, some of these experiences can help us access that. And it can speed up our evolution, because we need to have enough people who evolve to higher levels of development. And I know you know the resonance of that. And we can go into spiral dynamics and we can go into all that. We're not, but we could. We need to have a critical mass, a tipping point of people who will embody this and live it in the world. We need avatars. We need improvisational avatars to point the way. And it's not any one savior. It's each person looking in the mirror, becoming the best they can be, he or she, in what they do and in the fulfillment of what they, as a unique individual, came to earth to do in this particular incarnation.
That is a terrific description of most of what I'm thinking of when I say shaman. An embodied improvisational avatar and a culture that supports that and draws upon it.
Yes.
Now, one of the things we talked about the drugs part, another thing classical shamanism has in common with classical jazz, say, is just sound, right? The drumming, the dancing, the rhythm. I was thinking this morning about a time a few years ago where I, on purpose, tried to get into Led Zeppelin one summer. I was vaguely aware of them, but it had never really been part of my experience of anything. I thought, I'm going to get, every day I'm going to spend 15 minutes learning about Led Zeppelin. And for a couple of weeks, it was just brute force. And then one day, Bring It On Home was playing. And I stopped listening to the noises and started listening to the spaces between the noises. In that moment, it's like I could enter this vortex. I felt like I grokked the song in that moment and saw what they were doing with the sounds that made them so impactful at that time. And this sense of attuning yourself in flow by attending to the rhythmic gaps seems like something the shamanic drummer and probably a lot of great musicians do, whether they consciously think of it as that practice or not.
I hear you. I would agree. I would say that when you think about shamanism, you think about the music of traditional and tribal societies, a lot of it's based on taking you into trance states. And you could say a similar thing in jazz, though jazz being such, a part of our modern, postmodern, and integral frequencies, I'll put it like that, there's more complexity and even more, I would say, sophistication. But I would explain certain things like this. In jazz, you have, in terms of rhythm, the basic rhythm of jazz is swing. And swing or swinging is when the drums is riding the cymbal. The bass is walking. And together they are creating, I talked about difference and sameness. They're creating that sameness of moving forward together in that swing rhythm. The pianist or the guitar player is doing some differences, comping, accompanying, and doing it in a way that's syncopated. So it's not just the bass is going boom, 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 the drums, and they're doing that together. That's the sameness. The piano player or guitar player is putting in points and interspersing rhythms and harmonies at different times. The improviser, the saxophonist, the trumpeter, and of course the drums and bass and piano are also improvisers. But in this construct, let's talk about the lead instrument, which is usually a trumpet or a sax. They are then creating all kinds of differences, all kinds of variations on a theme. But that rhythmic foundation, that consistency, that unity is like the foundation upon which all of the differences and changes are built on. So for me, when I think about myself when I was a teenager, really just getting into jazz, and I would do these experiments of listening. So I'd be listening to a great quartet, and I would take in the whole sound, but then I would focus on a particular instrument and focus there. And then I would go to the other instrument and focus there. And I would do that then 2 at a time and 3 at a time and then come back. So there's a way of entering the music, as you were saying with Led Zeppelin, there's a way of entering it so that you're actually a part of that sonic, acoustic audio experience. When you talk about playing or being within the sound or within the notes, I think about Miles Davis. Miles Davis was a master of the use of space. So what he played was, the notes that came out were important, but as important were the silences in between the notes. See, all of that stuff does go together. So there are connections. I think that notice that I made a distinction, and I didn't mean for it to be an invidious distinction or comparison. We just know that in terms of our development at the shamanic state, that's early human history, And again, I'm not going to get into SD. I'm not going to get into spiral dynamics here, but I'm not going to do it. But there are connections, but I'll just end this part by saying, I think it's important, as you are doing, to not only transcend our earlier stages of human development, but to include them. I think that's the integral move, going even back to that. So I honor what you're doing, my man.
Well, I appreciate that. I think there's there's an easy tendency in terms of developmental theory to be a little bit pejorative about earlier and simpler phases.
Absolutely.
And there's always a way of redefining the essentially valuable figures and concepts in a way that is trans rather than pre.
Yes.
And I think it's essential to do that, because that is also, like you say, where you fold in all those virtues from the past and make sure you're not just, breaking yourself off at the end.
That's right. That's right, because we need all of that. It's a part of our human development, and all of it's essential. And if you cut off any one part, which is why each stage of development is in reaction or response to the previous stage. And it's like, when we get to that stage, which, you know, some call integral, some call, transmodern, there's all kinds of terms. We should have an awareness and an understanding enough to realize it's all part of us, all necessary. Each stage, including that stage, has pros and cons, light and dark, shadows and light, you know. And we want to bring as much light as we can. You know, that's the goal.
There's an element as well about having, however advanced we get, having a world that's humanly satisfying. And a lot of the things that are satisfying are the most basic things. You know, that we can't just rely on an ever-advancing prefrontal cortex to reveal new artificial wonders. You mentioned Jamie Wheel and the Flow Genome Project and transient hypofrontality, which is a great term. And one of the things that means is you're not going to rely so much on this. It's more satisfying, and you are more functional when you're drawing on more of your archaic circuitry, because that's the longest period of our development. And that's also where we did the most. You know, you can, yes, adult consciousness is impressive relative to the child, but the child's consciousness develops so much faster than the adult's consciousness, right? And same with the shaman. Going from zero to culture is a huge move.
It is.
And to get some of that acceleration back, to get some of that naturalness back, to achieve higher consciousness in a way that's really embodied and satisfying and human and friendly to the ecosystem and friendly to our instincts. I think that's important.
I think you're absolutely right. That is hugely important, to embody it and embody all of that. I mean, you know, we can be so intellectual, but you know, one of the things I've learned in my studies, Layman, that we don't have this one brain, got three. Now, of course, you know, the old joke about, you know, guys, they got two brains, you know, one up here, one, you know, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about here, the heart and the gut. And I'm going to be, you know, I like the way you talk about some of the things that you're studying and working on. And I've respected you for years, man, in the integral space and on Facebook and stuff. I love your spirit. I love how you embody so many of these principles. First of all, to me, you're a jazz man in this sense. You take the information, the knowledge, the wisdom, you integrate it in a certain way, but you do your own thing with it. In jazz, they talk about having your sound. What do you have to say? And you're doing that. You're not just following Nietzsche, and I know you're big on Nietzsche, but you're not just following Nietzsche or Wilbur. You're doing your own thing. And I really respect that. So I want to just, you know, make note of that in this conversation. But man, I'm going to be doing studies on the gut, heart, head connection, because the integration of that is so important. You know what I mean? And the basic pleasures, I'll just leave with this. What I thought of when you were saying that is beginner's mind. When you're first learning something, that enthusiasm is there and you're like eating it all up. One of the keys to life, I think, is to maintain a beginner's mind when one is still a master, or one is a master or a master craftsman. You have that openness to learning. You're so right. Children are so open, and they're playing all the time, and they're growing and learning through play. So how can we reintegrate play into our lives like children as adults? That's one of the things that I think is key to improvisation and to jazz.
I think so too. And I think one of the things that, I mean, there's different ways to look at what might distinguish the future shamans, the world shamans, from the tribal shamans of the past.
Right.
Not that the tribal shamans of the past don't have important roles to play. But if we're looking at this future role, this emerging role, I think one of the things that characterizes it is a greater intentional sensitivity to play.
Ah, yes.
Our ancestors, God love them, they lived some hard shit.
Oh,
And
my
it made
God.
them hard. Right? They were a serious group of people, ancient humans, for the most part.
That's right. Ooh, they had to survive, boy.
Now we've got our extended safe childhoods. Now we've got this room to be more playful, more flexible, to bring this childlike thing in and protect it and keep it at the center of our maturation.
Yes.
So I think there's a very beautiful thing in what you said on that topic, and also on the subdivisions of our subjectivity, let's say. Whether we want to go left and right, or whether we want to go heart, mind, and body, or heart. There's or the chakras as well. There's lots of ways to break it down.
Right.
When you were talking about the 3, I thought about the 7.
Yeah.
And I thought about the kinds of exercises that might support improvisational capacity, right? Because I was thinking about, you mentioned having a sound, right? I thought about having a voice.
Right.
I really like artists.
They're synonymous.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, chakra-wise, we'd associate that with the actual voice region.
Right.
And I thought about glossolalia and people who,
Speaking in
just
tongues.
try to open up the noises.
Right.
And then every part of our system, whether it's 3 or 7 or 15, you got to do something to open up all those parts.
That's
right? You got to shake your tail feather. You got to jump around. You got to, they have to be functional and loose enough that you can follow what's coming up.
Right.
Because improvisation means you have to, you can't be stuck. You can't be stiff. You can't be locked off.
That's right.
And
absolutely, man. I think of the practice of scatting in jazz. That's where you use your voice like an instrument, and you make musical sounds with syllables to mimic, what instruments do. So I'll just give you a quick example. Let's see. There's so many songs. Let's see. Confirmation. That's a Charlie Parker song. So that sound I was making is called scatting. So greats like Ella Fitzgerald, John Hendricks, the person who started scatting and so much else, Louis Armstrong, they are creating these sounds to express themselves in kind of a gloss, like a speaking in tongues in jazz of sorts. Yeah. You know what I mean? So, and this is another interesting dynamic. I've got to write about this. The thing about the interplay between the voice by singers and instrumentalists who play, the instrumentalists are trying to sing like great singers. But in jazz, the singers are trying to do what the instrumentalists can do. And that's the scatting part. So there's this interplay. And then when you talk about Black American culture, again, this is something I intend to write about, how amongst the singers, a lot of the male singers, they go into a falsetto. So that's in the upper range like a woman, traditionally. But then you have so many great female jazz singers who are not sopranos, but are altos and contraltos. And they can get into this rich bottom, like Sarah Vaughan, that's almost down there like tenor, like a man. So it's like there's this particular stretching of human capacity beyond our gender identities to more of a fuller shared range of our integrated maleness and femaleness. Now, of course, I know with an X, there's more than that, but I got to learn about all that stuff.
Well, there's a long tradition of shamans and drag in most countries.
Okay. Okay.
When you were saying about scat, I thought about when I was a kid, a movie that meant a lot to me was the Blues Brothers. And seeing
Okay.
Cat Calloway do Minnie the Moocher,
Yeah.
scat call and response.
Heidi, Heidi ho. Heidi ho. Yeah. Uh-huh.
One of the things I love about that is, in a way, it lets you gain clarity on the syntactical structure of language and thought and what you're doing, because you're taking off the normal association.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you wanted to speak in gibberish, you'd still hear something that sounded like grammar. You'd still hear these rhythms. You'd see yourself making a point. You'd see the logic of what you're doing very purely. And I think that's in a way, it's a primeval exercise. I keep coming back to this figure of the primeval priest, but you imagine this person who stands at the beginning of culture, where there isn't really even language yet, where everything that's being said is being made up for the first time. And they have the opportunity to see with exquisite clarity what they're trying to do with communication, because it isn't bogged down with an assumption of what the words mean, or an assumption of the forms, or an assumption of your gender identity.
Right, right. That's true. I mean, I think back to, it makes me draw upon some of the studies of phenomenology, Husserl. And some of his work, I think he talked about looking at early human language. And I don't want to misquote him, but I just think of, like, if you think of what they were doing, there had to be a connection between nature and the sounds that nature made, and then the creation of words to communicate. So there had to be some type of onomatopoeia of sorts, you know what I mean? Yep. To create certain sounds that had then certain meanings that allowed us to extend our capacity to communicate, and then that opened up all types of things in terms of human culture. So it's very interesting, and I have never connected it until this moment. Think about the early human practice. And I appreciate you going back to the well, so to speak. In jazz, there's a practice of innovation upon innovation. So you'll have a great classic solo by Charlie Parker or Clifford Brown. The solos will be so well constructed and architected, so well designed and executed, incorporating unbelievable technique and the deepest human feeling, that people will be so moved that they will feel the impulse to write lyrics to the instrumental solos. In jazz, that's called vocalese. And there have been some great examples of this. I'll give you two quick examples. Jon Hendricks, who's probably the greatest vocalese jazz writer. He has two classic vocalese songs. One is based on Miles Davis' Freddie Freeloader from the Kind of Blue album, which is the best-selling jazz album of all time. On that recording, you have John Coltrane, Cannonball Adderley, Miles, Bill Evans Miles on trumpet, Cannonball on alto, Train on tenor, Paul Chambers on bass, and Jimmy Cobb on drums. What Jon Hendricks does is he writes a tale about this figure, Freddie Freeloader, who actually was a bartender who would give out free drinks. Freddie Freeloader. And it's a cautionary tale about Freddie. And for each solo that he writes the lyrics for Miles' solo, it's a character study of Miles. And then it's a character study of Train. And you'd love this. For Train, who went into a heavy religious and spiritual journey in the last 9-10 years of his life, he has Train preaching about various things. Cannonball is more devil may care. So that's his personality. It is a masterpiece. And then the second one is called Joy Spring, song by Clifford Brown. And what John Hendricks does, he takes the words Joy Spring, and then he makes a whole rendition based on the melody and the solos on the Fountain of Youth. And he takes you through Shakespeare. He goes through the classic myths. I mean, it's incredible. So there's this impulse with sound and language to integrate the two. And in jazz, that's one of the ways to do it. So, you know, we're riffing, we're improvising here. You know, I'm hoping that the folks who are watching this, you know, can get something out of it as we go off and come back, you know.
Yeah, I've got no idea how consistent it looks from the outside at this point, but I'm having a great time with you.
Okay, cool. Me too, man.
I was thinking about, you know, I've got some young kids around me, and it's an interesting balance to try to give them cultural information without overriding the forms of intelligence they seem to already want to practice. And
Right.
one of the things I try to do is to get them to name things, you know, right? They're going to learn the names from other people at some point anyway. So, you know, what is this? How does it feel? What word would go with that feeling? What would say to you? That's what that is. If you were here, if you were the first one, what would you name this that would make sense to you? And it involves a lot of the unconscious, because you've got to find that thing. It's not in the front of your brain. You don't just have that information. You're looking for it. And so much of what we've been talking about, I think, does involve the unconscious mind, whether it's, you know, even the expert in the efficiency of what they've learned draws down, as the flow state does, draws down the front of the brain to use these older systems.
Right.
And where does your sound come from? It's not something you can think up in advance, not something you can remember and repeat.
And why is it,
like that? Yeah.
Excuse me for interrupting, but why is it that once you play an instrument and you work on your sound and you develop your sound, no matter what instrument you pick up, that breath that comes through to create your sound is your sound. It's you, no matter what instrument it is. So you could have people playing the same instrument, but that breath of life and that breath, that voice that comes through is yours uniquely. There's something special about that, man.
It's a very universal principle, I think. You practice it in the particular, but if the particular practice is right, then the result is very general. You know, wisdom is like that. You're doing particular practices trying to get a general effect.
Yeah.
And I think I'm very tempted all the time toward this idea that the unconscious mind is really the consciousness. And a lot of us use the word consciousness in a way that you basically would have to define it as unconscious, right? Consciousness, not just the things in my mind, right? And the psychologist would be, well, you're talking about unconsciousness then. You're like, okay, I'm talking about unconsciousness. That's fine.
Right.
But what I mean is there's something else there. There's a richness and organic complexity in the system. It's the one doing the evolving.
Right.
I can learn something new and I can repeat it back. And on a verbal questionnaire, it might look like I've attained a new level of consciousness. But I haven't necessarily done that unless it's gone into a part of me that I can't see, and then it comes back out of that part in a way I can't predict. So
which sounds improvisational. That sounds improvisational to me, man.
Exactly. And so if our self-development, if improv is the key to improve, if our self-development relies upon the unconscious, we need to be asking ourselves what practices cultivate unconscious intelligence. And like you were saying, getting really good at one particular way of expressing your sound, that may well be one of the practices that stimulates growth in the unconscious, and then it can come out better, more intelligently, more coherently.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds good to me, man. Hey, where's Bruce? Where's Bruce?
Are you there, Bruce?
I thought this was gonna be a trio here. I thought we were gonna have where you at, man?
It's been really hard listening to you go back and forth, and I've wanted to jump in so many times. Yeah, I'm a musician myself and have played music for a long time, and really relate to this conversation about improv and feeling into your sound and connecting with others. I have, of the many things that popped to my mind, I have two things that I'd like to bring up. One is I ask a question just to Greg, and that is, in your lifelong kind of immersion in jazz culture and in really the spirit of improvisation, have you felt any impact on your own psycho-spiritual being in the way that you show up? How has jazz riffed you?
That's good. That's real good. Oh my. What comes, I don't want to say to mind, because really what comes to heart is rhythm. There's a certain rhythmic orientation that I have to what I do, how I speak, how I interact, that is very influenced by jazz. There's a certain, at least I attempt to have a certain flow. I would say, in terms of like a psycho-spiritual development, that developing fundamental and advanced skill sets is like grounding. That's foundational. But being open to allow myself to be improvisational in the moment, so that the improvisation becomes ideally wisdom. In other words, you don't know what you're going to say or do in a particular situation, but you want to be open yet centered enough that what comes through you in the moment is the right thing at the right time for the situation and for the person or people you're dealing with, so that improvisation then can become a tool, resource, and expression of wisdom. Now that's kind of like an ideal, and I certainly can't say that I'm striving to do that more often. I can say that, frankly, in the last 2-3 years of consistent meditation practice, of a lot of work on my emotional reactivity, what triggers me, I mean, really dealing with what I guess in certain circles they call shadows. I really improved a lot. I got a long way to go, but I look back at myself, even 10 years ago and say, damn, I tell you, it's one thing to have intellectual understanding. That's a whole different thing than embodying it, living it, and being it. Big difference. I've known certain things intellectually since my 20s. I'm just coming to live much of that now in my 50s. Yeah.
What do you think's the biggest obstacle to that whole process you just described succeeding? What gets in the way? What derails it?
You mean generally or for myself?
Well, either. I'd like to hear both.
Right. Oh, man, we get in our own way. I think I'm going to use Michael Beckwith very quickly, because I think he can help me answer this. He has a process called life visioning, and in it he has 8 life structures. Everything from livelihood to community to spirituality to belief systems. It's 8 of them. And one of the things he says that your goal initially is to stabilize these life structures so that the reason that you came here, that your destiny can flow through unimpeded. You want to have enough money so that you can take care of your necessities and your family, so that you can live in the fullness of what the heck you came here for. So a lot of times when we have either our body temple is not together, it impedes us. If our emotional understanding and our ability to handle our emotions, manage our emotions is off, that impedes us. If your finances are, if your finances not together, it's hard to do certain things. It's just reality. So I think that most of the times it's not having developed in these various areas that I'm referring to the point where you can be free enough to truly express and be what you came here to do and be. Because I think we all have some type of destiny. We have individual fingerprints and footprints. I think we have an individual mission. We have an individual, destiny of some kind to express. And there's a lot of stuff. Good Lord. I mean, past trauma, oh God, there's so much that gets in the way. But if you can be critical enough, you can stand back from it enough and look at it somewhat objectively. If you can go from being subject to it to object to it, you guys have heard the subject-object connection, I know. Then you have an ability to then, be separate from it, and then realize what the heck you got to work on it so that there's less and less impediment. Use jazz as an example. I want to learn how to improvise. I can't get up there and sound like Charlie Parker. Most people, even once they practice, are not going to be able to do that. But the point is, you got to learn certain basic things. You got to get your scales down. You got to learn your chords. You got to learn the song structures, blues, A, B, A, I got rhythm form. You've got to learn the American songbook. There's so many things you have to learn on your own. Then you've got to learn how to play with other people. You got to play at different tempos. You got to learn how to play according to the mood of the song. There's just so many things to learn before you can truly improvise at a high level in jazz. So you say, what's the impediment? The impediment is people not taking the time to get through what they have to get through to get where they need to go. And it ain't easy, and it takes a long time. But you keep on keeping on.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. It reminds me a little bit of Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, of needs, yeah.
I've got, when it comes to my own flow states, there's two sides to it. One is something I do with my attention. The other is, am I getting my needs met? Do I even know what they are? Am I even willing to let myself have needs? Right? And yes, I live in a house where I can get water. How often do I need to drink water? What feeling goes on that actually requires water? I might think I'm tired or moody, and actually I just need a half a glass.
Exactly. That's why I've been drinking water here, man.
It's a lot of work to figure out what your needs are so that you can take care of them, so that you can get them out of the way, so that you're there in that place where your improv, where your flow states can maybe come to life and maybe turn into wisdom.
I think Maslow's a great example, man. Self-actualization. Absolutely. You want to get there, but you got to have those basic needs met, to be able to get there. So I think that's another avenue towards some of the same wisdom.
So there's the one other thing I wanted to bring up here. Talking about improvisational avatars. I wanted to ask if either of you are familiar with Bradford Keeney.
Bradford Keene?
Keeney.
No, I'm not.
Yeah, he's a family therapist, and actually was a really well-known family therapist, wrote some defining textbooks, and created some tools for assessing effective therapeutic communication, introduced cybernetics into family theoretic formulations on how to work with the information flows in groups. And so he was really firmly established in the establishment of psychology, and after so many years began to feel this isn't really working. We're really not tapping the potential that he felt was there for human transformation. And he began to feel around and look at what's missing. And he recalled once when he was in college, he was out walking on campus and got attracted to go into a chapel. And he went and sat down in a chapel by himself, was just staring up at the ceiling, and his body just like started to shake, and he just like felt this energy moving through him. And he went into this state of ecstasy, and his body kind of lost control for a while. And then he kind of came to and had no frame for that at all, and walked away and forgot about that experience and just dove straight into the psychological world and just shelved that experience. But he began to wonder what was moving through him. And long story short, he ended up going and studying with traditional healers around the world, especially living with the Kalahari Bushmen in Africa.
Wow.
And they accepted him as a natural shaman, and taught him, how they do healing. And he emerged from that, because I was thinking somewhat about the pre and the trance and the kind of inversion that we sometimes maybe need to play with.
That's right.
One of the things that he came out from that thinking is that psychology is not a science. It's the youngest and most immature folk healing modality that we've developed so far. And that there's much richer traditions. You can go back in the tribal and the shamanic traditions where they're not only focusing on verbal exchange, they're not only focusing on analysis of meaning making, but they're bringing in the full being, the sound, the movement, the energy circulating through the body, dance, ritual, magic, all of those things to stimulate the full being. And he found that all of that's at play in a lot of the healing ceremonies. And our culture, especially under the influence of the East, is teaching us, get calm, get in control, find your center. He's saying in many of these cultures, the idea is to lose control. The idea is not to become reckless, but to actually let go of that control over the energy in the body, to allow for a much more fluid flow, where you really are put into that improvisational place, where you're really on the edge, and you're able to allow energy to circulate through the body and actually to release trauma, the same way the animals will release trauma by shaking it off, So anyway, that's just, to me, he ended up coming back, and now his therapy looks like people scatting and playing jazz and trumpet and exchanging symbolic things and going off and having, vision quest type experiences. And
wow.
So he's incorporating a lot more of the human being into the way of finding ourselves and finding our balance and wholeness.
Wow. Thank you. How do you spell his last name?
Keeny.
Okay.
I did
Bradford?
read,
Bradford,
Shaking
yes.
the Spirits Out?
What's that?
Shaking the Spirits Out? Something
Yeah.
like that, yeah? By Keeny.
Yeah, he's got a book.
I'm going to definitely check him out.
It was a very interesting book. I thought some of the appendices were very good, too, on that one. I was thinking of, you said that, Nietzsche's first book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, although the second part of the title is usually left out. And he says we need a musical Socrates is what we need now to regenerate the culture. And something along the same lines would be, a Buddha who shakes.
Right.
Bringing in that Keeny dimension, because you have to be loose to let this through. And it's not just the old school letting the Shakti flow through. It's also a new school opening to everybody and to everything, and to the uncertainty of the world, to the complexities that demand anti-fragility, and to the deeper and deeper appreciation of relationship that we have now. Because you've got to be able to shake, you've got to be able to do improv in order to have a good conversation, especially a good intimate conversation.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that I noticed about you, Layman, is like, as you're listening, you're moving, because, you're taking it in. I'm checking you out. So, there's something about movement and embodiment. So one of my mentors, Albert Murray, here's a book of his Library of America, collected essays and memoirs. He has a book called Stomping the Blues. So when you look at the blues, as such, as he calls it, And I bring him up because I think Nietzsche and, a musical Socrates, I think, he is one of those types of people. He talks about the blues as such being sadness, depression, being down. But he says that blues music is a counter agent and counter statement to the blues as such. And that when you have groups of people together, in particular, the group, the idiomatic group out of which jazz sprang, which are Black Americans, you had the Saturday night function and the Sunday morning church service. The Saturday night function was where you got together, you had a good time, you're drinking, you're courting, you're stomping the blues. You are celebrating life. You're acknowledging, if you listen to blues lyrics does not avoid or deny the truth of life. It takes it and looks at it straight up. But just in the process of facing it, and with other people who are engaged in this ritual, and you dance and you move and you have a good time, you ain't feeling the blues as such. And then what he says is that it goes from you'll appreciate this when you talk about the shamanic, Layman. You go from a purification ritual to a fertility ritual, see? So you can continue the species. You know what I mean? So you're really having a good time stomping the blues. So that's an example of taking ritual, taking actual, social and cultural dynamics of life and framing in a way where you're looking at it as a way in philosophy to deal with and contend with life, and ultimately to still celebrate life through play, through communion, through having a good time, and you stomping the blues. But he says, you only do it temporarily. The blues is always coming back. You can't avoid it. It's only temporary, you know what I mean? But you keep doing it. Now, I want to read to you all from the last part of one of his classic books, was published in 1973, The Hero and the Blues, because it relates to improvisation. And this is what he says. Perhaps above all else, the blues-oriented hero image represents the American embodiment of the man whose concept of being able to live happily ever afterwards is most consistent with the moral of all dragon encounters. Improvisation is the ultimate human, i.e., heroic endowment. It is indeed, and even as flexibility or the ability to swing or to perform with grace under pressure, is the key to that unique competence which generates the self-reliance and thus the charisma of the hero. And even as infinite alertness become dexterity is the functional source of the magic of all master craftsmen, so may skill in the art of improvisation be that which both will enable contemporary man to be at home with his sometimes tolerable, but not quite certain condition of not being at home in the world, and will also dispose him to regard his obstacles and frustrations as well as his achievements in terms of adventure and romance. My man Albert Murray was like a musical Socrates.
I like that. It's very, the blues is very Nietzschean, very Dionysian wisdom. Because it's about, and, we talked earlier about the yes and move that's inherent to improv. And there's a yes and in integral objectivity, yes and subjectivity. Singularity, yes and plurality. Right. And there's a yes and, in the music, and there's a yes and in the conversation. There's also this other heroic yes and, which is you say yes to the dragon, right? To the trauma and the insufficiency and the limitation of finitude that we live in.
Yes.
And I'm going to enfold that. I'm going to transfigure that. To me, that's what the blues is. It's the golden transfiguration of the suffering of the world. And
Beautiful.
like you say, it's only going to succeed for a moment. And that's why teaching and training the skill set is what counts.
Yes.
You can't get one piece of wisdom. You can't get one form and that's going to be it. You need to get better and better at enfolding and transfiguring.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself, man.
I think we've gone over our 50-minute target.
All right.
How do you feel, Bruce? Just about time to wrap up?
I think that was the perfect place for wrapping up, and the extra minutes were totally worth it. I thought this was a fantastic conversation.
Well, I just think it was a real pleasure, real delight to talk with you.
Same here, man. I mean, this is great. I mean, we've been online, we've been communicating and communing and witnessing and checking each other out online for years. Yeah. This is the first time that we're actually interacting like this. I love it. It's really great. I really appreciate you guys inviting me.
Yeah, anytime. If we can figure out some reason to do it again, I would love it.
I'm open to it. Let's do it.
All right.